What is a brand? The definition of brand is many and varied. In fact, I started my business because I used to work for a big corporate and we'd travel all around Australia talking to people and we'd have conversations about brand and positioning and all these abstract ideas. I'd come back weeks later and talk to people and we'd talk about what we'd done over the last few weeks, and it was really interesting. We'd use words like brand, but it clearly meant something different to me, something different to the other person, and something different to somebody else in the room. Brand is one of those terms that needs to be clearly defined so that all can get on the same playbook. I'm going to introduce you to brand as character. Brand as character is critical to your understanding of what real brand is. A brand is not a logo. You can think of great brands and great logos come to mind: FedEx, Nike, Adidas, Qantas, Virgin, wonderful brands. But more than a logo comes to mind, a set of thoughts and ideas. How people speak, how people look. Even more than that, big ideas about solving big problems and the way people go about doing business. Brand is character. Who you are, what you stand for, how you're different and why you're different, and who you're there to serve. That's why we define brand as character with three parts: heart and soul, mind, and body. And I'm going to break this up for you throughout this journey on what is brand so that you can use this framework simply, easily, anytime, anywhere. It's actually worth going back in history a little bit to understand how brands came to be. You see, we live in what I call the 21st century hangover of real branding. We've had 100 years of corporatized, bastardized effect that's really biased our view on what brands really are. If we go back in time, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years, we're probably in the Middle East, standing in some sand somewhere, riding a camel, part of a tribe or a big family. And you know what? We've probably only got one name. That one name is enough because we're part of a tribe, we're part of a nomadic group of people. Because I'm part of that nomadic group of people, and you can go back and read the history books and they're many and varied, what I believe, how I act, the currency I use, the language I use, certain parts of my personality, so much of me is defined by that group of people, that tribe, that family unit. So much so that I don't need a second name, I'm just somebody of that tribe. That's really important. Let's fast forward maybe 1,000, 1,500 years or so, and we start to see the first big empires emerging. We see the Assyrians, we see the Babylonians. From the Babylonians, we see the Greeks. From the Greeks, the Romans. And you know what? As each of those big empires go out and try and take over the known world, they would impose their brand, their way of doing things, their culture, their language, their currency on everybody that they conquered. Over time, your nomadic character, your individual character was crushed and squashed by some of these empires. That's if you were lucky to survive the battle. So we find that no longer were we somebody of a tribe, but now we were somebody of an empire. Alexander the Great, for example. Let's go forward maybe another 500, 600, 700, 800 years and look at the Roman Empire, because some interesting things started to change in the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, not only were we somebody of a place, but the role of households were really important. A household, often led by a citizen of Rome, a person of significance, oversaw what you could almost describe as a small business, a household of 30, 40, 50 people, workers, sometimes in the market, out on farmlands. That leader, that household name, brought you protection, brought you power, brought you strength, it gave you currency. You could trade on that name. You had a seal of that name. We see character and name and reputation taking a change with households. It's really interesting. There's an idea in Roman culture that we actually carry on to this very day, born out of households. Households had slaves, and that household would be a mix of citizens, family members, slaves. Some slaves were maybe treated better than others, and certainly the idea of slave, whilst horrific in Roman times, also held some unhorrific connotations. And you could almost say that being a slave, a certain type of slave in a Roman Empire, was almost like being an employee in a company today. I'll explain. That slave, when they would earn their right to be free, could actually become what's known as a bond slave. A bond slave, that's a term we still use today, bond, was somebody that said, you know what, I actually find the work I do in this household quite fulfilling. It's safe. I have found my sense of belonging within this household. And you would say at the end of your term as a slave to the household, the owner, the leader, or the head, I'd like to stay. And if they accepted that, and typically they would take you out to the front of the house in the Roman street, they'd take your ear, take a pick, and they'd whack a hole in your ear and stick a ring through it. And that ring would signify that you were a bond slave to that household, that you had actually bonded to that household, almost adopted in. You weren't a child or a family or a citizen, but you had more rights. And you took on the identity of that household. Really important. If we fast forward, by the way, I actually think sometimes as people wear earrings or logos like Nike on their t-shirts or tattoo certain things, they're actually really saying, I'm choosing to be a bond slave to this identity. When I put on my Nike t-shirt as an advocate or being a sponsored person, I'm now a bond slave. It's exactly the same concept, just under different contracts. Fascinating. Let's go forward a little bit, because this is going to help you understand what brands really are and where they came from. As we go forward, we see that names, identity, reputations, not just informed by households, but now starting to be informed by the cities or the towns from which you come. And there's none other famous example of this than the great artist Leonardo da Vinci, who we know as Leonardo, but the Da Vinci really in Italian means of Vinci, the town of Vinci. Leonardo of the town of Vinci. He took his identity in his name, whether it be at that generation or through his ancestors, because he came from that town. Where did those towns mostly come from? Well, they came from Roman households that established households and farming towns or precincts that became towns, really. As those households got larger, they would be employing the people to work the lands, and as people would come, go, daughters would marry, men would marry, towns built up around them. So we see this move from Roman households to settlements to towns, and throughout the Middle Ages, we're now taking on our names and identity, not from the household, but from the town or the place or the region from where we came. Once again, if I came from that town had a dominant culture, philosophy, language, God we worshipped, so clothes we wore. We were identified and branded of that town. Come forward another few hundred years, and we're starting to move into some specialisation, 14, 15, 16, 1700. And strangely, what we've become known for is not the household we're from or the tribe we're from or the city, town or region we're from, but rather the thing we do, bakers, blacksmiths. I'm sure some of you listening to me right now are going, oh, of course, that's where I came from. I was a great baker, so therefore I became known as Baker. My first name might have been John, so I became John Baker. We start to see identity framed by what we do. You know, what's really interesting is as the industrialised era really took a hold of that and specialisation took a hold, we moved out of villages into cities and towns. Those second names that defined us started to become businesses. We started to see things like Blacksmith and Sons emerge. And you know, one of the great inventions of the industrial era was the industrialisation of money, capital, banking systems, credit systems, things that today we just take for granted that 200, 300, 400 years ago, just unattachable, unattainable to the common person. And so Blacksmith and Sons looks around the local villages and towns and says, well, my boys need more work. I'm going to go buy another business. Blacksmith and Sons grows. Blacksmith and Sons needs to grow faster. Blacksmith and Sons goes and visits this new thing called the Banker over on Fleet Street. Suddenly, Blacksmith and Sons has the capital to industrialise. Blacksmith and Sons opens a factory. Blacksmith and Sons drops the and Sons and just becomes Blacksmiths Corporation. You know, not too dissimilar to Ford Motor Corporation, General Electric, Bell. You know, the list goes on. Some brands that we still have today. At the end of the day, those brands were great brands, not because they had fancy logos on billboards and websites, which quite frankly didn't exist back then, but rather they were great characters who consistently did what they did well so that they grew a reputation that ultimately meant they were the best positioned and best sought after. At the end of the day, brands are great characters. And when we understand that, branding becomes so much simpler, becomes so much more powerful. Brands are not logos. Brands are not colour schemes. Brands are not ads. Brands, dare I say it, and a little bit controversially, were once people like you and I doing what we do. And we became well known for it. We just live in this 21st century hangover of how the corporate balance sheet has bastardised and biased what brands really are. We've outsourced brands to brand managers. That's kind of weird, isn't it? That's like saying, oh, I need a character manager. That's interesting. You know, the most amazing businesses in the world understand that brands are just character. Externally, that's reputation. Internally, that's culture. And that when you can build, identify, scale that character, you can scale branding. That's what this whole journey is all about. When you can learn to unlock brand as character, a character that people fall in love with, and you can teach more than one person to be that character. Now, I'm not talking about Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck or those kinds of characters. I'm talking about human characteristics, a reason for being, a way we do things, a way we think, a way we act, practices we do, the clothes we wear. Yes, colour, look, feel does have a role to play. If we can learn how to do that, we can build wonderfully true, aligned, clear brands. If we scale businesses and don't understand how to do that, do you know what happens? I'm sure you do. we say one thing over here and we start to do another thing over there, and over time it separates. What we say, how we act, what we do changes. A gap emerges. It was Marty Newmer in the early 2000s that published a wonderful book called The Brand Gap. Makes this really simple. Our job as leaders, business owners, is to identify where those gaps are and close them. To be true to who we are so that our customers receive a consistent experience. Now, I know that every time I've strayed from that in my own brand business, I've suffered greatly. I know you have, and you will too, because you have to learn those lessons. But if we can reduce the amount of lessons we need to learn, then I can help you build a wonderful brand, a wonderful you, a wonderful collection of you. Brands are people. People see brands through the lens of human characteristics. Let's be and build great humans. Welcome.